often talk about continuous delivery, but we also talk about continuous integration, but less and less so than ever before. One of the themes for our discussion today is really to look at how organizations are using both monolithic enterprise environments and microservices, and what happens to techniques and processes that have previously been quite common. Continuous integration fits right into this environment, so to speak. And so I'm curious on what's happening to continuous integration and why is it fading?
Oh, I love that question. I absolutely love that question. So let's think about what continuous integration was, right? Continuous integration was the effort of creating a process where when you are writing source code and you've got several developers working on similar pieces of code, similar libraries, you needed to be able to figure out if you broke it. And so we came up with this process, we as a community, to check in your code and check it out and compile it on a high frequency basis as often as you can. Break it, break it, break it, break it, fail early, which was really great and monolithic. And that's what CI was all about. It wasn't really about a workflow process. It wasn't about progressing software between dev through prod. It was really about continually integrating your code and making sure your builds didn't break. Well, what a microservice doesn't have a build. I mean, yeah, you can argue it has, if you're writing Golang, you're going to compile Golang. But let's say you're doing Python or even JavaScript, what does that even look like, a CI process? So two things that are sort of becoming less important in a microservices world is version control. You're still going to check in code, you're going to check in your Python, but you don't necessarily need to make sure it didn't break the build. So you may not want to do a check-in and compile every time you just want to store your code you worked on during the day. And your build goes away. Our build now is basically creating a container and registering it to a container registry. So my prediction is most work will be triggered not off of a check-in of a source code into a version control system, but we're going to start seeing things triggered off of having a release candidate, which is a container that's ready, that's been registered and is ready to go.
So I want to see if we can clarify things here a little bit, Marky. And so perhaps you could help me understand what it means to make version control less important when Git is essentially a version control environment, right? It's like you're thinking about how do you continually update a container, for instance, not even, how do you just basically just think of a container overall, because a container can just be replaced very easily. So you can have the updated components. So help me clarify this thinking about a version control system in a monolithic environment versus Git and continuous delivery and container technologies in a more of a, that continuous delivery environment that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think previously in the monolithic world, every time you did something, checked in any type of code, meant any type of small change, you did a build. And I think that's going to start changing more so that the version control will not be as prevalent. It will now just be an artifact in your risk analysis to deploy. That's where I see the future going. So we'll look at not the version of Git or the test we run in Git, but we'll look at that as an artifact to make a more intelligent decision for our integration and deployment into environments, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, if you think about it, when you're talking about a microservice, you're not talking about a piece of code that's 3,000 lines long.
Right.
So the reason why Git was such a disruption in version control is because it did such a great job of branching and merging. You know, we could create streams. That kind of development practice is not going to be something we see in a 100-line Python script.
Exactly. It'll just be part of an artifact. And you'll make an intelligent decision on how you deploy that. How you make your release candidate ready for production will be a series of decisions. And the Git versioning will just be one part of the decision.
Deep thought.
I'm waiting for Colin
Deep
to say
thought.
I mean, one change that is, well, I mean, there are two that I find interesting. One is it's surprising that, you know, in hindsight, it's almost intuitively obvious that it happened, and that is Git Ops. And the reason I say it's intuitively obvious that it came to happen, but at the time, I don't know if anybody would have predicted it, is we started doing configuration as code. Like we started doing, you know, Chef and Puppet and Salt and Ansible. And, you know, inch by inch, we slowly, incrementally got closer to, you know, Git Ops being great because it's developer workflow for operations, which I think is a quote that I'm stealing from somebody from Weaveworks that I can't remember the name of. But I find it interesting to, you know, look back in hindsight and see something that's obvious, like, you know, all these dots lined up, and then think just what are the challenges and what could be next.
And that is the right question to ask. What is next? That's what we all should be talking about. You know, where are we headed? What's the future look like? And having these kinds of conversations helps us understand. I think when you figure out what you have to let go of, then you understand what you have to grab onto.
So what are you letting go of, Tracy?
What's being let go of?
What are you letting go of, for example? What do you think I mean, and like if you look at your workflows and your processes, what do you see you letting go of?
A lot of things. A lot of things. First of all, a pipeline. I know. You're going to let go of your pipeline? If you think about microservices are not appropriate for being pushed through a pipeline. If you have let's look at a Netflix, 4,500 microservices. You can have a pipeline for every one of those, and they're going to run in a serial way. You're going to have approvals for those. It's impossible to manage. It just is impossible. So we're going to let go of a pipeline. We're going to have more of an event-driven world where a microservice, like I'm predicting, you're going to trigger something from a new container being registered and ready to go. We're going to have to start thinking less in serial ways, dev, test, and prod, waterfall, and more in a three-dimensional way that is even something that right now Git Ops really can't solve, because Git Ops cannot say, here's a single microservice that's being consumed by 5 or 10 different applications running on 6 different or 60 different clusters. So we have to be seeing things more in a three-dimensional way when we think about what the pipeline looks like. We got to get rid of the pipeline, dev, test, and prod. Service mesh is going to let go of that. We're going to be able to start shrinking the number of clusters we have and using service mesh to route things. So we have a really different world ahead of us. And we're going to be letting go not only of just the way we think about trying to branch and merge a 3,000 line piece of code and compile it and make sure it can compile in less than 10 minutes, to how do we track configurations of pieces and parts? How do we start pushing away the concept of dev, test, and prod? And how do we start leveraging the new technology in a way that's going to allow business agility to succeed?
I would add to that, and I think one thing that will change is the sanctity of production. And so thinking that production is, you know, this protected thing and you must, you know, preserve it for only the best of the best, and, you know, it has to go through a number of gates. I mean, I think what's already happening and will continue to happen is if your code is ready and you put it up for PR, that code should maybe be running for a small percentage of production. If your code gets approved by a fellow developer, that code should be running for a larger percent of, you know, developers. And things like, you know, APM and feature flags and branch by abstraction are a large mindset change. I still have trouble with it. I still, you know, I mean, it's definitely a change that I know is happening and will happen, but I still have problems with. Like, I still like to have, a QA environment. I still like to proofread everything there. The idea that, if the code looks good to the person that wrote it and looks good to somebody that reviewed it, it should be able to run in production, and, a segment of production becomes your test environment is scary, but I think inevitably will be good.
I think the risk analysis part will be really key in the future, especially to verticals such as banking and insurance and health, to be able to make an intelligent decision without a human having to do something, and know that that decision that's being made is true, it's right, and you can push something to production via some form of automation with intelligent risk analysis layered on top of that is really the key, in my opinion, to where I see things going. I see a lot of tools coming out of that as well.
There was a really great question somebody posted about separation of duties and, disregarding the sanctity of production, which, Colin, by the way, I'm going to steal that because I think that's an awesome phrase. I think that what you have to start thinking about in terms of a cloud native environment is, let's forget about it being a production cluster, right? Let's just forget that. Think about a production node. And service mesh can route to a production node. So you can have security in your cluster as well as having this new world where you're deploying something and then you're rerouting your users based on service mesh. So it is, again, we have to think in a new way, but we can bring old concepts into the way we think. And if we think about a node running a particular basically container that is the production approved version, we can do that without having a dev, test, and prod cluster.
So that service mesh that you keep referring to. Oh, I just saw the doggy. It just decided to leave the room.
I know.
Oh, there's the cat's over here. You can't see us. But so service mesh is another example of things reemerging, but also disappearing to some extent. We really needed a new way to think, for instance, about APIs. And it seems like back in 2006, 2007, the REST API was just this fundamentally new way of thinking about just opening interfaces and sharing information and creating robustness that we had never really seen before. Now we're in a world of components, and where the application is what matters, but it's the components that really constitute the application. And so service meshes get complicated really, really, really fast, don't they? And much like the REST API of the past, we're still trying to grapple to understand actually how to think about service meshes. So we're in this kind of awkward time, aren't we? What is disappearing about the API right now?
Well, the APIs aren't going to disappear. They're actually going to be bigger because everything's linked via API at runtime. And I think that some people get confused by the differences between API development and microservice development. They're different. Somebody recently on a panel discussion compared the API like you're going to go to the doctor's office and you check in. The microservice is the visit to the doctor, which I thought was a really great analogy. I've tried to explain it many times. But yeah, we are at a very awkward place. We are crawling when it comes to cloud native and really building applications on it. Most of the funding and the focus has been around building out the operating environment itself. We're still learning about how to, spin up, clusters. We're still trying to figure out how to manage namespaces. What are we going to do with them? What are tags? How do we use a CRD? Once we get that figured, and most companies, I think, are playing with that in a containerized application, not a microservice-based application. So once they have some of the basic stuff figured out, we're going to start seeing more growth around the application. And once we see more growth around how to build applications in a cloud native environment, I think we'll see more investment and more work on maturing the tools that we're talking about today. We'll have to.
I also see the work that's being done to sort of standardize the terminology used across various, not just tools, but let's just say, for example, in the CDF, standardizing terminology that we use really leads to better work that's being done on the tools that you're talking about, because then everybody knows we're reading from the same sheet of music.
Boy,
The
that's
same sheet of
the
music,
case.
can you tell me what you mean by that? Like, what do you mean here? I'm trying to get it.
So,
Like, there has to be some like standardized kind of thinking about service mesh.
about service mesh, but if you also think about creating extensibility in a given application or a microservice, you want to be able to make sure that the extensibility you're trying to create, you have the same terminology. So for example, think of a event-driven architecture for a various application. If you're using the same terminology across, it's easier to create things that work interoperable with one another.
Terminology has always been something that's held us back. I can't even tell you how many times I've had discussions with people and they think about continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. Continuous delivery and continuous deployment's always used, in my opinion, incorrect. Yeah. And continuous deployment is really continuous release, just like continuous test or continuous security. Continually scanning for containers is not continuous delivery. Continuous delivery is the process of progressing software from one point to the next. Software doesn't always go from cradle to grave. It sometimes gets to test and fails and then has to rotate back. That's the continuous delivery pipeline. And there's an ecosystem around it. And one of those things is deployment.
Correct. Yeah. And also thinking of it as more of a value stream and understanding how the feedback loop works within that value stream. When you explain that to the executive level people, it's easier to understand than saying, well, I'm going to do CI and this is CD and this is how the sometimes that loses. But when you think about it as a value stream and the aspects of a value stream, it's easier for other people to understand.
Hey, we have some questions here. They're popping up here in our chat and the Q&A. And the question that came in from an anonymous attendee. So we can't talk about microservices without pipelines? And I'm confused too, because when you're thinking about, for instance, like how you're thinking now about data and how you think about how you set up data to be used effectively, like data engineers have historically had to really, data scientists have had to, use a lot of different tools and even different machines. And so now we're thinking about pipelines as ways to kind of think of data in like a Git environment so you can version it to some extent. So help us understand that, what that question is about. Microservices without pipeline. Can you not talk about it in that way?
I think you can. I think you'll still be talking about pipelines for a long time, because the concept is going to be, it'll be sort of hard to move away from. Everybody will always think of it as a pipeline. What I do think is that how individuals or companies use that pipeline will change dramatically, and it'll almost invalidate the term pipeline, because you really won't even, in my opinion, you won't focus on the pipeline anymore, because you'll have checks and balances within that pipeline that you just sort of forget it, because that the risk analysis is being done.
And it could be, we could rename it something like checks and balances, because what's going to happen is you're going to have, instead of having things executed serially, you do your checkout. Let's just think about a pipeline today. You do a checkout, you do compile, then you push it out, you deploy it to some kind of a dev server. If that works, you execute another workflow, you tell to testing to go ahead and test it, deploy it to their environment and test it. This is very serial. And in microservice, I think with event-driven, an event-driven CD process, which is going to be more important in microservices than it is in monolithic, you're just going to have things fired off all at the same time. It's not going to be as serial. You can do it. You can do testing and security scanning at the same time. One doesn't have to be dependent upon another. So you're going to be able to, you can push it out even if it, because there's not going to be a build that breaks. So we don't have to have that kind of checkpoint. We already have a container and a registry. We can then trigger several events to run at the same time. And it doesn't have to be serial. So that when I talk about pipeline, I'm thinking the serial process that a pipeline refers to or gives the image of is going to be now more like a starburst, where you have an event and things start happening based on that starburst. You're ready to, run all of these processes at the same time and get it done as quickly as possible. And you're going to be running multiple container scans at the same time, because you have multiple things happening constantly. You don't have the idea that we're going to push this workflow even once a day or once a week.
So Colin, there's a question that came in, maybe you could help us with this, is that if you run all containers, and this is from Randall Jacobs, if you run all containers in the same environment, how do we ensure the continuity of the environment aside from the code running in the container? Randall says, I like the idea of good container, of production containers, but our cloud providers also to provide SLAs to support this new environment.
Very carefully. I mean, I think that story is still being defined, but I think we will get there. So, I mean, how it's currently being defined is things like, feature flags, branching by abstraction instead of branching by Git, service mesh, canary rollouts, kind of continuous deployment, and integrating, checks and balances. I kind of like calling them guardrails, because I like to have those guardrails up even when I try to commit code, just to double check that I haven't made mistakes. So guardrails like, automated APM integration, automatic rollback. But yeah, I think it's something that we need to continue to iterate on. I don't think I have a full and complete answer, but I think we're getting there. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Marky, or?
Well, I want to just, before we go there,
Sure.
I want to give Marky and Tracy a chance to kind of answer any of the questions that they find interesting that you're seeing in the Q&A right now, because we only have a few minutes. So maybe I'll start with Marky and then we'll conclude with Tracy. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So Marky, are there any questions that you see in there that you'd like to answer? And if not, I can help you with one.
Well, Randall's question in regards to continuous environment and how you maintain the integrity of that environment is a super interesting one. And I think what you'll see in the future, Randall, is that when you have built, let's say, machine learning into how you deploy, and that machine learning does a risk analysis, and it remembers that risk analysis by training the model. So it always knows what artifacts were there within that pipeline, and then it makes an intelligent decision for future deployments based off of that data points that it's gathered. That's how you'll maintain that, because it will always know that the model and the machine learning aspect will always know the previous data points that gave it a successful risk analysis. And I keep using that term, risk analysis, because I really believe that's where we're going to go. Hopefully that answered your question, Randall.
Tracy, take it out. Was there a question here you see that you'd like to answer?
I want to just build on what Marky just said. That will be where we're headed, that risk analysis. We need to be able to have, I like to call them truth tables. We need to be able to look at a microservice and say, hey, this microservice impacts 10 applications. It needs to go through a stronger, more strict pipeline, to use the term, than one that is only impacting one feature. And that takes me to feature flags, and I can answer that question about feature flags. Microservices will replace this the concept of feature flags as we see them now, because a microservice is a feature. And you won't be deprecating feature flags, because you don't really, microservice is immutable. Eventually you get rid of it, but you just route. You're going to route to, by taking out a feature, you're just routing to a different microservice.
Well, this sounds like a great question we could ask of LaunchDarkly, that's for sure.
Yep.
And so I would love to keep talking. There's so many questions here, but we are out of time. And I want to just thank our panelists. This has been a lively, quick discussion. There's more we could discuss, so I hope this conversation continues. Thank you all for participating.